There we go. Right. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Over to you.
Good morning once again, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying their breakfast even more this morning, as still we are just on the aftermath of the fast this week. And I always think it's a bit of a strange thought. I had a teaching a lesson in the build-up before we broke up school, and had a student ask me, what time is it when we can start to watch Netflix on Tisha B'Av? When's that point this year? And in a hand when, you're dealing with teenagers, and let's be honest, perhaps when we're dealing with ourselves, and maybe just big teenagers, that we know Tisha B'Av is a hard day, but we get to that point of Chatzos, or as close to Chatzos as we can get to, and we've finished Kinnis, and there's a program in the afternoon with some films and some meaningful activities, but we get ourselves off the floor, and we kind of look forward towards the summer and look forward to, well, we've done that now, we've been Miss Abel, we've shown signs of mourning over the past few weeks for the Beis Hamikdash, and now life goes on. It always sits slightly uncomfortably with me because although life goes on, if we look across to Israel and we look across to Yerushalayim, then the words of Eicha still ring true. But I think the answer is that I always heard, and that brings me some kind of comfort, is that yes, the Churban is still there, but we are one step closer to the end of it. And because we've been through that process of trying our best to connect to the Avelis, to the feeling of loss of the destruction of Yerushalayim and the state of the Jewish people, and that yearning, that desire, that longing to be back in a state of security, in a state of pride for the Jewish people and security for the land of Israel, specifically in the times that we're in. That yearning, that collective will, that refocus brings us closer to ultimately to the Geula, to the redemption. And therefore we say we've done our focus. Now we do have to go back onto daily life. So I think therefore even more so a reason to say kol hakavod for those who are organizing the breakfast this morning is it's a siman, it's a sign of we've done our Avelis, we're now past the 3 weeks and the summer weeks, and we can kind of move on from that point. I wanted to share this morning some thoughts that hopefully are practical on an area which is something that the Gemara needs, that we need constant chizuk, constant work and strengthening in this area of our Jewish experience, which is tefillah. The beginning of this week's parasha, Parshas V'eschanan, starts with Moshe davening once again that he should be allowed into the land of Israel. In fact, the Medrash famously brings that V'eschanan is the gematria of the number of hundreds of tefillahs that Moshe prayed that he should be allowed into the land of Israel. And what's fascinating is that we learn out certain halachas and certain concepts from that particular tefillah about how Moshe davens. Rashi brings at the beginning of the parsha that the word V'eschanan is ein chinun b'kol mokim eloloshem matnas chinan. The word V'eschanan means that Moshe was asking for free, meaning that when he davened to Hashem, he didn't daven asking that Hashem, you owe me. I am deserving, I am worthy that my tefillah should be answered. He asked for it as chinam, for free. I may not have the sus, I may not have the merit that my tefillah should be answered. I may not be worthy or may not be deserving, but I'm asking out of your mercy, out of your goodness and your kindness, that you answer my tefillah. And therefore we see this is an expression of tefillah that we often have of V'eschanan, of offering our supplications for Hashem without expectation, without entitlement. I think many of us that deal with younger people, whether they be grandchildren or they be employees or colleagues, of that sense of, magirli, that young people often, it's just a sense of entitlement that they live with today. If there's so much going for them, they kind of just feel like it's coming to them. But when we're davening, that's not supposed to be the case. We daven with the expectation that we are perhaps not deserving our tefillahs to be answered, but we ask Hashem in His kindness and His mercy to answer our tefillahs anyway. Fascinating, what I saw pointed out is an incredible insight when it comes to tefillah is that from these tefillahs that Moshe davened, we learn out things for our tefillahs ourselves. But yet these tefillahs were seemingly unsuccessful. And that tells us something really fundamental about davening. Davening is not a transactional process where we say we arrive with our shopping list of requests and demands and leave with them fulfilled. That's not what happened here. Moshe asked, please allow me into the land of Israel. And he davened hundreds of tefillahs. The answer ultimately was no. No, the Gezerah stands. The decision that Moshe would not be allowed into the land of Israel, the answer was no. So yet we might think that is a tefillah, that's an expression of Jewish prayer, which would be null and void. There's nothing to learn from this tefillah. But in fact, it's exactly the opposite. The fact that Moshe davened just for the sake of davening, even though ultimately the outcome seemingly was no, that does not nullify it as an expression of tefillah. Tefillah is something which is much more fundamental, which is expressing that connection, that faith to the Almighty through that act of prayer. And prayer is something that we spend hours each week engaged in. Therefore, for that reason, and we can understand why the Gemara says it's something that we need to be constantly thinking about working on and improving, and to try and make connected to in a sincere and meaningful way. Otherwise, there is a danger that it could become something which we just do by rote, 3 times a day, coming to shul and rattling through our prayers and saying all the right words in the right places with the right motions that go with them, and then leaving and feeling unaffected by those prayers. I think, unfortunately, in the times we've lived in recently, we've been shaken into realizing that our prayers are important, our prayers count, thinking about the situation that the Jewish people find themselves in around the world. So I wanted to share with you 5 particular tips that I wanted to try and work on together that we could think about in order to strengthen our prayers. And that's what we'll do over the next few minutes. 5 tips, 5 ideas based on different sources that we could try and think about perhaps on a daily basis that will help us try and feel engaged in our davening, inspired by Moshe's tefillah at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev. The first idea I have actually mentioned here before, because I looked in my notes last night and realized, as part of a different share from December 2023, I had mentioned this idea as a footnote before, but maybe we'll elaborate on it slightly more now. The Brisker Rav of Chaim Soloveitchik was one of the great Torah sages of the latter years of the Jewish people in Europe before the Second World War. He revolutionized the way yeshivas learn Torah from his teachings. That he became influential the world over, and he would often he wrote primarily on the writings of Maimonides, of the Rambam, and he would often try to see where the Rambam seemed to contradict himself. And his famous idea was what it became known as Yiddish as Tzvei Dinim. If you've got a source that seems to be saying contradictory things, it must suggest that there are therefore 2 different ideas that may seem similar, but are in fact distinct, that could be used to explain that contradiction. That was one of his big ideas that he used in his writing. And I'll share one of them that's relevant, that appears in the writings of the Rambam when he's dealing with the laws of tefillah, and explain how he answered this seeming contradiction. So listen up for the problem in the text here. In Perek Dalid of Hilchos Tefillah in Halacha Tesvav, and he says, "Kavanas haleiv ketzav." What does it mean to have intention of your heart when davening? We know we're supposed to think about what we're davening. We're supposed to have kavana, intention. And he says, "Kol tefillah," perhaps scary words. "Kol tefillah she'ena b'kavana, eino tefillah." Anytime one davens without kavana, without proper intention, that's not called davening. V'im hispalo below kavana. If a person would daven without kavana, you'd pray without intention. Chayzer u'mispalo b'kavana. Like Monopoly, you'll need to go back and do it again. A person that stands up and realizes they were davening, they weren't really thinking about what they were saying, you would need to daven again. He says, "Matzadaita mishubeshes v'libo tarad." If a person finds himself in a state where his mind is mixed up with different things and his heart is occupied with other things, he's feeling what we might call today anxiety. He's worried. He's preoccupied thinking about what's going to be happening in the business meeting at work he's going to attend, whatever it might be. He says, "Asa loyle hispalo ad shitashiv daito." You can't pray until your mind has settled. A person can't pray with a busy head. That's the first source in the Rambam. He therefore mentions a sort of side point, "Lefikach haba min haderech lehu ayif or matzar asalo lispala ad shetaishav daito." If a person's coming in from a long journey, you shouldn't pray straight away. Sit down for a minute, have something to eat, have something to drink, rest a few minutes, get yourself ready in the mind space to be able to daven, and then daven. It's worth pointing out the Mishnah and Brachas mentions that the Hasidim Harashonim, the early pious ones, would wait a whole hour of meditation before praying. Wow, and our Shacharis doesn't even last an hour, and they would spend an hour in meditation before they prayed. They pray for an hour, and then it took them an hour to come back down to earth in order to engage in their day. Ask the Gemara if that was what their prayers looked like, and we can work out, therefore, they spent 9 hours every day engaged in preparation prayer or coming back down to work for prayer. How did they get anything done? Answers the Gemara, they had siyata d'shmaya. Their prayer was so impactful and so effective. Whatever they needed to be busy with, they did it in double quick time, that they could spend so much of their prayer engaged in today. Now, that's not halacha l'maisa. That's not how we're supposed to daven. In fact, there is an advantage in not schlepping out prayers. That's the idea of tircha tzibur, in order that people shouldn't become distracted. But we do see that this idea of having kavanah in prayer is key. That's the Rambam in the 4th parak. Let's skip now to the 10th parak. Listen and see, can you spot the difference? He says the following: if a person prays and doesn't have an intention in their heart, you should go back and pray again with intention. And if you had intention during the first bracha of the Amida, you don't need any more. So hopefully we can see the glaring contradiction in the words of the Rambam. The Rambam told us in one place that a person that davens without kavanah, seemingly you need to be thinking about what you're saying for the entirety of the Amida, then you didn't daven. That's not called prayer. That's called reading words, whatever that might be. You may get some kind of reward for coming to shul, but you don't get the reward of prayer. Whereas in the 10th paragraph, the Rambam has told us, as long as you're thinking about the first bracha, you've got kavan during the first bracha, that of Avos up until Magen Avraham, that's enough. You don't need to worry about the rest of it. At least that amount. That's the minimal amount. Well, which is it? Do I need to have kavanah for the entirety of tefillah? Think about what I'm saying. Or as long as I've said the first bracha with kavanah, then I'm enough. It's enough. That's the question that Rav Chaim Brisker, among many others, asks on this Rambam. He answers the following. It's clear that the Rambam must be talking about 2 different types of kavanah when it comes to tefillah. Therefore, there's a type of kavanah which is necessary from the entirety of one's davening, and there's another type of kavanah which is only applicable as a minimum to the first bracha of the Amida. What's the distinction in these 2 different types of kavanah? This is what Rav Chaim Brisker calls, there's kavanah of da lifnei ata oimed. Know who you're standing in front of. When one's davening, if you have the appreciation, you are talking to Hashem. If you don't have that thought throughout your davening, then, as the Rambam says in Perek Dalet, and again the Perek Yud, that's not called davening. If a person is just reading the words, but they're not thinking about an awareness of, I am standing and talking to Hashem, that's not called davening. And that is necessary, that thought of an awareness and a consciousness and a mindfulness that you're talking to Hashem, that's a necessary kavanah for all of tefillah. However, when it comes to the idea of only needing kavanah for the first bracha, that says that Rav Chaim Brisker is in terms of perush hamilim, in just understanding the words that you're saying. A person as a minimum needs to understand the meaning of the first bracha of the Amida. If they don't understand the language of all the rest of the other subsequent 18 brachas, then they've davened, but they need to at least understand the praises that they are referring to in the first bracha. So therefore, the Chaim Brisker distinguishes between these 2 types of kavanah. So I think perhaps we can take from this idea one salient idea. First of all, obviously the advantage we have of having Sidurim with flowing and accurate and meaningful translations is important and something we should take advantage of. But to at least make sure that we are trying to get ourselves into the mindset of when we are praying, we are standing and talking to Hashem. Now that may sound painfully obvious, but I'm sure we've all found ourselves during davening, whether it might be thinking about what's for supper, thinking about what the weather's doing outside, or whatever it might be, the mundane things that seem to pop through our heads during davening. I often find my most meaningful thoughts are during davening, but may not necessarily have anything to do with the davening itself. But to try to work on that, it's not easy, whether it's a half an hour davening or 45-minute davening or just the 10 or 15 minutes of mincha, to try and start at least with that intention of now I'm talking to Hashem within this space of time. That's tip number 1, to daven with an awareness that we are talking to the Almighty. Let's go through 4 more tips before our time expires this morning of thinking about that we could try and strengthen our tefillahs with. The second tip is found actually in the writings of the Arizal. And I'm not familiar particularly with the writings of the Arizal, but it's brought down in many other sources. The Arizal, one of the great Kabbalists of Sfas. And he says that in order to strengthen the potency of one's tefillahs, you'll notice that the Siddur is written in Lashon Rabim. It's written in the plural. That we never just daven for ourselves, we're always davening automatically for the entirety of the Jewish people. He says it's an expression of the idea that's referred to in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, that a person may daven, and they themselves may not have the merit for their tefillahs to be answered. But when we're davening as a tzibur, we're davening as a collective on behalf of the Jewish people. The collective of the Jewish people has a power that Hashem doesn't turn away our tefillahs empty-handed. And even when there are gezeras against the Jewish people, when the Jewish people as a collective do teshuvah and daven to Hashem, those tefillahs have the power and potency to be answered. Therefore, the Arizal said there is a particular kavanah that is written in many siddurim. Before a person starts davening in the morning, they should think about a particular mitzvah. Which mitzvah is that? The mitzvah of loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And that, he says, is a conscious intention that applies to the entirety of davening. Because you're thinking, automatically one would feel, I'm coming into shul and I'm davening for all the things going on in my life and the things that I'm aware of, whether it be one's family or one's friends or one's neighbors. But actually, he says the Arizal, one should stop and think, I have a mitzvah to have my needs as relevant to me as all of the Jewish people around me, and therefore now I can express that through the tefillah, which is written in the plural. And therefore, that's our second tip, to try to be aware of the idea that when we're davening, we're not only davening for ourselves, but we're davening for the entirety of the Jewish people. And as the Arizal says, to think consciously about fulfilling the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as you love yourself before one starts davening. So seen. Tip number one, based on the writings of the Rambam, which is to have an awareness that we are talking to Hashem when we're davening. Tip number two, based on the writings of the Arizal, which is the idea of thinking about the mitzvah of Habto Lecha Kamocha. The third one, I'm sure this is not a necessary mussar for the crowds we have here, but it's one worth mentioning because the Chavetz Chaim writes incredibly strongly about this in his Ber Halacha, which is printed in the Mishnah Berurah, which is the third thing which one needs to be incredibly careful with in order to make sure one's tefillah is answered, is to make sure that during davening time there is no other conversations taking place. Says the Ber Halacha, based on earlier sources, writes an incredibly strong language, a place where there is talking during davening in shul, that creates a barrier between the tefillahs and Hashem. And I was thinking about this in preparation of the show. Why is that? Why should it be if a person's, sitting and talking about whatever it might be to their neighbor on the pew as davening is going on? Why should that block the tefillahs? I mean, it's just an innocent conversation. What does it matter? We're not even talking about, by the way, someone that's speaking with foul language or someone speaking Lashon Hara, just mundane chatter during davening. Why would that be? Well, I was thinking if we could compare it to if you had a private audience with King Charles or a CEO that could grant you a great contract that would bring great wealth, and during that meeting you would just turn us aside and say, "What do you think is going to happen in the cricket?" I mean, you can imagine the CEO or the king or whoever it might be of importance would say, "Are you serious? You're talking to me and talking to him at the same time. Don't waste my time. Out you go." I think perhaps that might be a way to understand. If we are really serious about the fact that we're asking Hashem for things, we're praising Hashem, we're showing that with meaning, and we have the chutzpah to have a chat at the same time, might show, in fact, that maybe we're not taking our tefillah so seriously. So tip number one, as we said, we'll go through them each time, is to be thinking about an awareness we are talking to Hashem. Tip number two is to be thinking about the entirety of the Jewish people with the mitzvah of Havtzalech Kamocha and Tefillah. Tip number three is to make sure that we are not engaged in any other idle chatter during the time of davening. Of course, before, after, it's a lovely time to have a schmooze and a catch up with people, but during Tefillah, that should be something we avoid to do. Two more tips that we'll conclude with. One is based on a modern idea I saw from someone called Rabbi Meir Druk. And he said the following idea. It's based on a segula he saw from a certain tzaddik he mentions in Yerushalayim, which I think is a very interesting idea, which is that a person can use the idea of thanking Hashem as a way to ask Hashem for further assistance. What does that mean? He told a story of someone that came to see him that had developed some kind of eye condition and was losing their sight, and he came to him asking for a bracha, that his eyesight should be restored and the treatment he was undergoing should be successful. And what Rav Druk told him was he should sit down and thank Hashem consciously and intently for all of the blessings he'd experienced by the fact that up until that point in his life, he'd had the gift of sight. And he sat and did this for well over an hour, talking to Hashem in his own words of the fact that he'd been able to learn to read and all the enjoyment he got from that, and be able to learn Torah and to be able to help around his home because he could see, and to be able to see his children grow up, and he could engage in the world and go to beautiful sights. And he went on and on like this in a genuine way. And Rav Juk said, once you've done that, you've expressed that thanks to Hashem in a real and genuine way, say to Hashem, and just like I thanked you up until now, grant me the ability and the grace that I should continue to be able to thank you for this blessing I'm experienced in my life. And he found this tefillah transformative. And I think it's such a powerful idea to say, think about all the blessings we have in our lives and think about those, thanking Hashem for them, and say, Hashem, we should be able to keep thanking you for those blessings we are experiencing. It's interesting because the Order Shemona Esrei is not like this. Just to point out, we do praise, request, thanks. This is suggesting that there's also an idea of doing thanks leading to a request to be able to keep thanking. But to say thank you, and just like I thanked you up until now, let me able to keep thanking you. So we've seen our 4 ideas so far. Our fifth idea, which is mentioned in the Gemara in Bava Kama, based on the story of Sarah and Avimelech in Sefer Bereshis, which is the idea that when we are davening not only for ourselves, but we're davening for another person that needs that same tefillah granted, then our tefillahs are granted first. They're given precedence and power for those tefillahs. So similar to the idea of the Arizal, but davening particularly for someone that needs that particular thing, a person that is experiencing some ill health. So they daven for another person, have another person in mind that also needs a refuah. If there's a child that you're waiting for to find a spouse, then you're davening for someone else's spouse. Also at the same time, if one of one's children is in a situation which is perhaps serving the army, you don't only daven for them, but you daven for also other chayalim that they should also be safe. This idea, I heard a beautiful insight. Well, what happens in such a situation when a person is davening for a particular need they have for themselves, their family, and it happens. They're davening for someone to have a refuah, and they get better. The person gets better. So there's always that question about: should I still be mentioning their name during the Mishaberach? Are they, or in the Shemona Esrei? Do I still need to daven for them? Sometimes the answer is Baruch Hashem, no, things got better. So what then? So an idea I once heard was, well, transfer that tefillah somewhere else. Maybe that person you were davening for doesn't need the refuah anymore, but don't lose that connection. Find someone else to daven for. Unfortunately, there will always be people to daven for, and find it as a way to connect. We'll finish with something mentioned in the Gemara that Rabbi Gamliel, who lived in the generation after the Churban Beis Hamikdash, the destruction of the temple, would often hear a lady who was a widow in his neighborhood who would sit at night crying, mourning over the loss of her husband. And he would hear this lady in his neighborhood crying over the loss of her husband, and he would sit and he would cry for her and her loss, and then he would cry for the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Once he was able to empathize with the pain and the feeling and the suffering of the Jew, then he could think about these higher, loftier, perhaps less tangible losses that we have for the Jewish people. But please God, with the 5 tips we shared together, we'll look forward to Mincha this afternoon or this evening, with great inspiration, with great chizuk, with the strengthening of the Eschanan, the idea of Moshe's 515 tefillahs that we see at the beginning of the parsha. But again, those 5 tips that we've shared are the idea of an awareness. We are talking in front of Hashem, the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as you love yourself, to think about that mitzvah before one starts davening, based on the writings of the Arizal. The idea of davening for not talking about other things during tefillah, of davening for thanking Hashem for things, and then asking to be able to continue to thank for those blessings, and also davening for another person that needs the same thing that we are davening for. Please God, all of our tefillah should be meaningful, should be answered for the good and for us and all the Jewish people.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for that. If there's any comments, I will sign off the Zoom. Bye-bye those on Zoom, and I will